Doctors said my surgery could not wait. My own son was the only compatible blood donor in the state. I begged him through the speaker of an emergency room nurse's cell phone, my breath failing, my chest torn open. He laughed over the sound of heavy bass and clinking glasses and said, "Dad, I am busy at a party. Just tell them to use the generic stuff. I will swing by tomorrow." He hung up while I was bleeding to death. At that very party, they announced I was dead. And what he did next proved that he was the one holding the shovel. My name is Harrison Caldwell. I am 68 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a master electrician, wiring the largest commercial grids and high-rises in the city. I am a man who understands power circuits and fail-safes. I spent my life making sure the lights stayed on and the structures held firm. I thought I had built a fail-safe into my own family. I was entirely wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the main beam of a heavy generator hoist snapped at a community center volunteer site. I was there running the main conduit panels for free, trying to keep my hands busy, and my mind quiet after losing my wife Barbara 2 years prior. 1 second I was looking at a blueprint, and the next, a rusted steel winch line whipped across the room with the force of a freight train. It tore through my side, ripping a massive, jagged laceration across my abdomen and chest. The pain was not sharp. It was a heavy, crushing force that stole all the air from my lungs and drove me straight to the concrete floor. By the time the ambulance doors slammed shut, my thick canvas work boots were soaked through with my own blood. The emergency room was a war zone. The fluorescent lights blinded me as trauma doctors shouted rapid-fire orders over the chaotic, terrifying beeping of monitors. I felt trauma shears cutting through my heavy work jacket. Someone was yelling about my blood pressure dropping into the danger zone. The cold sting of an IV needle hit my arm, but it was not enough. I heard a masked doctor say that my heart was working too hard to pump a rapidly emptying tank. That is when the true crisis hit. I have a rare blood type O negative, but with a highly specific, uncommon antibody. It makes receiving generic donor blood incredibly difficult, sometimes fatal. Normally, a hospital this size would have a reserve. But fate has a cruel, unforgiving sense of timing. A massive 10-car pileup on the interstate earlier that afternoon had completely depleted the local blood banks. The trauma surgeon, a young man whose scrubs were already stained with my blood, looked at my chart with wide, panicked eyes. He told me the registry showed only one perfect immediate match in the entire state. My 34-year-old son, Preston. I raised Preston to be a man of character. I worked double shifts in the freezing rain and the blazing summer heat to pay for his college. I funded his extravagant wedding to his ambitious wife, Jessica, and I loaned him the capital to start his own consulting firm. Barbara and I gave him absolutely everything. We thought we were raising a son who would stand by his family when the chips were down. I was about to find out exactly what kind of man I had built. A frantic trauma nurse, seeing my heart rate plummeting on the monitor, pulled out her own personal cell phone. She dialed Preston's number from my emergency contact list. I was trembling violently on the table. The cold was setting into my bones, a deep, terrifying freeze that started in my fingertips and crept rapidly toward my failing chest. The nurse put the phone on speaker and held it near my ear. It rang twice. Then the call connected. Instead of a quiet office or a car, I was hit with a wall of noise. Thumping bass loud laughter and the distinct clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the tiny speaker. Preston answered with a deeply annoyed tone. He said, "I told you I am not taking calls tonight. Who is this?" The nurse spoke quickly, her voice sharp and urgent. She told him this was City General Hospital. She told him his father was in critical condition with a massive hemorrhage. She explained the depleted blood bank, the rare antibody, and the absolute fact that he was the only match who could get there in time. She told him I was dying. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I gathered every single ounce of strength I had left in my collapsing lungs. I spoke into the phone. I said, "Preston, please. I am not going to make it through the night. I need you, son." I expected him to drop everything. I expected to hear the sound of panic, the sound of him running to his car to save his father. Instead, I heard a deep sigh of profound irritation. The music thumped louder in the background. Preston said, "Dad, you have got to be kidding me. I am busy at a party. This is a huge networking event for the firm. I have major investors here." The nurse looked at the phone in absolute shock. She yelled into the receiver, telling him that this was a matter of life and death, that his father had less than an hour before his organs started shutting down entirely. Preston's voice grew cold and utterly dismissive. He said, "Look, I am not a doctor. Just tell them to use the generic stuff. Give him whatever you have in the fridge. I will swing by tomorrow morning when things wrap up here." Then a click. The line went dead. He hung up on me. He hung up the phone while his father was bleeding to death on a sterile hospital cot. The monitor beside me began to scream a high-pitched, continuous alarm. The doctors rushed back to my side, their voices blurring into a dull underwater roar. The cold completely took over my body, paralyzing my limbs. My vision narrowed into a tiny dark tunnel. The last thing I felt was a crushing weight on my chest as someone started chest compressions. The last thing I heard was the flatline tone. Then darkness. A deep, heavy void where nothing existed. I died right there on that table, knowing my own flesh and blood had chosen a cocktail party over my life. I should not have woken up. But 36 hours later, the darkness began to recede, replaced by the soft, rhythmic pumping of a ventilator. I opened my eyes. The blinding fluorescent lights of the trauma bay were gone. I was in a quiet, dimly lit private recovery ward. The sharp smell of antiseptic stung my nose. I tried to move my arms, but they felt like they were bolted to the mattress. Tubes ran in and out of my skin. A nurse walked into the room. She was older, with kind, deeply tired eyes. When she saw I was awake, she let out a long breath of pure relief. She hurried over to check my vitals. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and dry like sandpaper. I managed to croak out a single word, asking how I survived. She poured a small sponge of water over my cracked lips. She told me it was an absolute miracle. When I coded, they managed to stabilize my heart just long enough to keep my brain alive. Meanwhile, the hospital administrator had called the state police. A state trooper escort had driven a compatible blood bag in from a donor registry 3 counties away, tearing down the highway at 100 miles an hour with sirens blazing to get to me. They rushed it into the operating room just as my organs were failing. I survived by mere minutes. I closed my eyes, a hot tear rolling down the side of my face. I was alive. The sheer will of a total stranger and the dedication of a state trooper had saved me when my own son would not. But then the nurse's face hardened. Her expression shifted from relief to deep, unsettled pity. She looked down at the clipboard in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. She pulled up a chair next to my bed and sat down. She said, "Mr. Caldwell, there is something you need to know. Something that happened while you were in a coma." She handed me a printed medical file. My hands shook as I gripped the paper. The text blurred for a moment before coming into sharp, terrifying focus. It was a medical directive, specifically a do not resuscitate order. A DNR. I stared at the paper in disbelief. The document stated that if my heart stopped again, or if my breathing failed, the hospital was legally forbidden from using life-saving measures. They were instructed to simply let me pass away. I looked at the bottom of the page. There, signed in bold black ink, was the signature of my designated medical proxy. My son, Preston. The nurse spoke in a quiet, disgusted whisper. She said, "He faxed it over yesterday morning. He never came to the hospital to check on you. He just sent the legal forms ordering us to take you off the machines." My breath caught in my chest. The agonizing physical pain of my lacerations was absolutely nothing compared to the violent, shattering realization ripping through my mind. Preston had not just ignored my plea for help. He had not just prioritized a networking party over my survival. When he woke up the next morning, knowing I was in a coma, he had actively signed a legal document to ensure I would die. I stared at his signature on the white paper. For 40 years, I used my hands to build up the city. I worked double shifts in the freezing cold and the blazing heat to make sure Preston never lacked for anything. I had wired hundreds of miles of copper to put food on his table and pay for his education. I had loved him with the blind, unconditional devotion that only a father can have. And he had tried to execute me from a distance with a pen. The grief lasted for exactly 1 minute. It was a suffocating wave of sorrow that threatened to pull me back under the medical monitors. But then something snapped inside my chest. The sorrow burned away instantly, leaving behind a cold, icy clarity, an absolute terrifying focus. I am a master electrician. I know how to trace a fault in a system. I know how to find the root of a short circuit and cut the power before the whole building burns down. My son was a corrupt wire, and he had just tried to burn down my life. I handed the paper back to the nurse. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at her with a steady, unbreakable gaze. I knew right then and there that I could not just confront him with anger. I needed to understand why he wanted me dead so badly. I needed to trace the corruption to its source. And once I found it, I was going to systematically dismantle everything he had built on my dime. The nurse closed the heavy door behind her, leaving me completely alone with the rhythmic mechanical hum of the medical equipment and the absolute crushing weight of the paper resting in my hands. A do not resuscitate order. It was not a cautious medical recommendation from a concerned doctor. It was a legal death warrant, executed from a distance. My 34-year-old son had weaponized a simple fax machine to finish the job the accident had started. He had signed away my right to live while I was bleeding out unconscious and entirely vulnerable. I did not cry. The tears had completely dried up the exact moment I recognized his rushed, jagged signature at the bottom of the page. For 40 years, my profession as a master electrician demanded absolute precision and unwavering focus. I was a man who diagnosed catastrophic faults in massive commercial electrical grids. I knew exactly how to isolate a dangerous short circuit, how to trace a corrupted power line hidden behind layers of drywall and solid concrete, and how to cut the main power before the entire structure went up in flames. Now, lying in that sterile, freezing hospital bed, my mind instinctively shifted away from the raw, paralyzing heartbreak of a betrayed father. I shifted into the cold, calculating logic of an electrician. My family was the broken circuit. The corruption was deep and it was active, but I could not fix a system if I did not understand the exact scope of the failure. I needed data, and I needed it immediately. My personal cell phone was gone, either lost in the bloody wreckage of the construction site accident or cut away with my ruined clothes in the trauma bay. I was completely isolated from the outside world. I lay there in the dim light, fighting through the agonizing pain in my abdomen, waiting for an opportunity. 20 minutes later, the door creaked open. An orderly walked in to check the biomedical waste bins. He was a young kid, maybe 20 years old, looking deeply exhausted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the night shift. Tucked under his arm, I noticed a digital tablet likely used for patient inventory logs or his own entertainment during the quiet hours. I called out to him. My voice was a gravelly, broken whisper, but it carried the desperate, heavy weight of a man who had just crawled his way out of a grave. He stopped and turned toward my bed. I told him I needed a massive favor. I explained that my family did not know I had survived the surgery, and I desperately needed to send a message before the morning staff arrived. I asked to borrow his tablet for just 10 minutes. He hesitated, shifting his weight nervously and looking back toward the hallway door. Hospital policy was strict, but he looked back at my face and saw the raw, unmistakable desperation in my eyes. He nodded silently, unlocked the screen with his passcode, and placed the tablet gently on my lap. He whispered that he would be back in exactly 15 minutes, then slipped out of the room. The exact moment his footsteps faded down the corridor, I went to work. I did not log into a standard email account or check social media. I opened the web browser and typed in a highly specific, complex numeric IP address. After my wife Barbara passed away 2 years ago, our house had felt entirely too big, too echoing, and dangerously vulnerable. I needed a massive project to keep my calloused hands busy, so my mind would not drown in the suffocating grief of losing her. So I spent 3 months wiring my entire property with a state-of-the-art closed-loop smart security system. I crawled through the hot attic to install high-definition cameras on the exterior eaves. I wired motion sensors on the perimeter gates and embedded hidden audio relays directly into the brickwork of the back patio. I tied the entire grid to a secure encrypted server locked in my basement. It was my fortress. Tonight, it was my spyglass. I bypassed the standard user login page and accessed the administrative backdoor I had coded myself. The screen buffered for a tense moment, the loading circle spinning agonizingly slow over the stark white background of the hospital network. Then the grid loaded. 12 live camera feeds popped onto the screen simultaneously. I fully expected to see my dark, quiet property. I expected to see the empty, moonlit driveway and the still branches of the old oak trees. Instead, the screen exploded with glaring light and chaotic motion. My long circular driveway was packed bumper to bumper with expensive luxury cars. Valet attendants wearing crisp white shirts and black vests were jogging rapidly back and forth across the manicured lawn I had mowed just days prior. The heavy oak front doors of my home were thrown wide open. Warm, golden light spilled out onto the front porch. People wearing expensive tailored suits and designer evening gowns were strolling casually through my front hallway. Preston had not just gone to a party while I was bleeding out on a hospital table. He had hosted the party. He had hosted it inside my own home. My chest seized violently. The fresh surgical stitches across my abdomen screamed in absolute protest as I leaned closer to the glowing screen. I tapped the glass to enlarge the high-definition feed from the main living room. I watched absolute strangers sitting comfortably on the expensive leather sofa I had purchased with Barbara for our 30th wedding anniversary. I watched them carelessly setting wet cocktail glasses down on her prized antique cherry wood coffee table. The blatant casual disrespect was a physical blow to my gut, but the visual insult was absolutely nothing compared to what I was about to hear. I switched the video feed to the expansive back patio. This was where the crowd was the thickest. I tapped the screen to engage the hidden audio relay. The crisp sound of a live jazz trio and the overlapping hum of wealthy conversations instantly filtered through the tablet speaker. I scanned the digital crowd and found him. Preston, my only son. He was standing proudly by the massive outdoor stone fireplace, wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that I had paid for entirely 2 years ago when he launched his consulting firm. Standing right beside him was his wife, Jessica. She was wearing a sleek, dark evening dress, holding a heavy crystal tumbler filled with a rich amber liquid. I zoomed the camera in. I instantly recognized the distinct heavy bottle resting on the table next to her. It was my 20-year-old single malt scotch, the incredibly expensive bottle I had been saving unopened for a truly special occasion. Preston tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The sharp, high-pitched ring cut cleanly through the chatter. The jazz trio stopped playing. The crowd quieted down and turned their attention toward him. I cranked the volume on the tablet to the absolute maximum, pressing the small speaker tightly against my ear. Preston cleared his throat. He looked out at the sea of wealthy faces, his business partners, local real estate developers, and corporate auditors. He took a slow breath and put on a mask of deep, somber tragedy. It was a performance so flawless, so expertly calculated, it made the bile rise in my throat. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Preston said, his voice echoing perfectly through the hidden microphone I had wired myself. "I know this was originally scheduled to be our annual firm networking event, but life has a cruel way of changing our plans. I received a devastating call just a few short hours ago." He paused dramatically, looking down at his expensive leather shoes, playing the part of the shattered, grieving son to absolute perfection. "My father, Harrison Caldwell, was involved in a terrible, catastrophic accident today at a construction site. Despite the absolute best efforts of the trauma team, he succumbed to his severe injuries. My father is gone." The crowd let out a collective, theatrical gasp. Hands flew up to cover mouths. Somber, sympathetic murmurs rippled across the patio. Jessica placed a manicured hand gently on his shoulder, bowing her head in a display of mock sorrow. I lay frozen in my hospital bed, staring at the screen, my blood turning to pure ice. I was not dead when he made that speech. I was currently fighting for every single heartbeat. He had signed the do not resuscitate order, hung up the emergency phone, and walked straight out to the patio to formally announce my death to his investors, before my heart had even had a chance to stop beating. But my son was not finished speaking. Preston slowly raised his glass of my stolen scotch into the air. "My father was a hard-working man, a practical, simple man who worked with his hands." Preston continued, his tone dripping with quiet condescension. "He did not care for grand gestures, long funerals, or prolonged mourning. He would absolutely want us to move forward, to look to the future, and to continue building our success." He took a slow sip of the liquor. "So in honor of his highly practical nature, I want to personally assure all of our financial partners here tonight that the Caldwell estate will transition completely smoothly. The sprawling property you are standing on tonight will be officially listed on the commercial real estate market by Monday morning. We are liquidating all of his physical assets to immediately expand our corporate portfolio exactly as he would have wanted." My breathing stopped. It was not a networking event. It was an estate liquidation celebration. They were drinking my top-shelf liquor standing on my patio, celebrating the massive influx of cash my premature death was going to bring them. Jessica chimed in, then her voice ringing out, dripping with artificial sugary sweetness. "Harrison was a truly wonderful father-in-law," she lied smoothly, smiling brightly at the wealthy guests. "We are completely heartbroken by this sudden tragedy, of course. But knowing we can utilize his lifelong assets to build our empire brings us a tremendous amount of peace. He always told us that we were the future." I squeezed the metal edges of the digital tablet so hard the casing groaned. They had written my eulogy as a corporate business pitch. They had turned my tragic, bloody death into a lucrative networking opportunity. The sheer, calculated, breathtaking evil of it took the remaining oxygen right out of my lungs. I watched the guests raise their glasses high into the air in a cheerful toast to my demise. As the applause died down and the crowd dispersed back into small chatting groups, Preston and Jessica moved away from the main gathering. They walked toward the far, dimly lit corner of the patio, stepping right under the thick shadow of the old oak tree. It was the exact, precise spot where I had mounted a secondary, highly concealed infrared camera to cover a blind spot in the yard. I quickly switched the video feed. The camera angle was much tighter here, and the audio receiver was infinitely clearer. Preston reached up and loosened his expensive silk tie. The fake, tragic mask of grief instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of predatory arrogance. He took a long, greedy swallow of his drink. He checked his luxury watch, looking highly annoyed. A moment later, a third figure stepped out of the shadows of the garden and joined them. I felt a sharp, agonizing twist deep in my gut. I knew that confident, swaggering walk. I knew that posture anywhere. It was Frank. Barbara's older brother. My own brother-in-law. The man I had fed at my Thanksgiving dinner table for 30 straight years. The man I had bailed out of absolute financial ruin time and time again when his shady auto dealerships repeatedly went bankrupt. Frank did not look sad that his brother-in-law had allegedly just died. He looked strictly like a man ready to do business. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He handed it directly to Preston, glancing quickly over his shoulder to ensure none of the party guests were watching them in the shadows. Frank's voice came through the digital audio feed, crisp, low, and absolutely chilling. "The offshore accounts are fully primed and ready to receive," Frank said, tapping the thick folder with a heavy finger. "I got the international routing numbers officially confirmed through my dealership shell companies an hour ago. The absolute minute the hospital formally issues the death certificate, we immediately transfer his union pension funds and his liquid savings. We bleed the family trusts completely dry before the state probate courts even know what hit them." Preston smirked, a nasty, greedy smile spreading across his face as he tucked the folder tightly under his arm. "Excellent work, Frank," Preston said. "The hospital administrator called me a few hours ago while the caterers were setting up. They were begging me to come down and donate blood for his surgery. I told them to shove it. The old man lost too much blood. He is an absolute goner by morning." "He better be," Frank replied, his voice dropping into a cold, flat, entirely ruthless tone. "Because if that stubborn old electrician somehow wakes up, we all go to federal prison for fraud." I sat in the heavy darkness of the hospital recovery room, the blue light of the tablet screen reflecting off my pale face. The betrayal was absolute and complete. It was not just an arrogant, selfish son. It was my own extended family. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated financial strike against my life and everything I had spent 40 years building. The orderly knocked softly on the door and walked quietly back into the room to retrieve his device. I handed the tablet back to him. My hands were no longer shaking. They were completely, terrifyingly steady. The overwhelming despair of a broken father was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, highly dangerous, and meticulous rage. They were eagerly waiting for a death certificate. They were waiting to steal a fortune from a ghost. I looked out the dark hospital window, feeling the slow, strong, steady beat of my heart in my chest. I was going to give them a ghost, but it was going to be the kind of ghost that dragged them straight down to hell. I lay in that hospital bed with the digital tablet handed back to the orderly. The glow of the screen still burned into my retinas. My own son was drinking my scotch and selling my life while my chest was stitched together with surgical wire. A younger man or a weaker man might have hit the call button, summoned the police, and screamed until his lungs gave out. But 40 years of pulling high-voltage wire teaches you something fundamental about survival. If you grab a live wire without grounding yourself first, you are the one who burns. If I called the police right now, Preston and Uncle Frank would immediately lawyer up. They would hide the money, destroy the paper trails, and tell the authorities I was suffering from post-surgical delirium. I needed to isolate the circuit. I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I waited until the floor nurse finished her 2 a.m. rounds. When the hallway went completely silent, I reached for the bedside phone. My fingers were stiff and cold, but my mind was running with pure, unfiltered electricity. I dialed a number I had known by heart since the 1970s. It rang 4 times before a gruff, sleep-heavy voice answered. It was Sullivan. Sullivan and I came up together in the electrical union. He was a retired representative, and before that a highly relentless private investigator who handled corporate fraud for the Brotherhood. He was the kind of man who could find a lost penny in a blinding snowstorm. "Sully," I whispered, my voice sounding like gravel grinding against steel. "It is Harrison." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Harrison, good God Almighty, man. The local news said there was a severe accident at the community center. I called your son 3 times tonight. Preston told me you did not make it. He told me you passed away on the table." "Preston is a liar," I said, every syllable dripping with a cold, hard truth. "And he is a thief. Sully, I am sitting in a recovery ward at City General. My son just submitted a forged do not resuscitate order to let me die, and he is currently throwing a party at my house to liquidate my estate." Sullivan was completely silent for 5 heavy seconds. When he spoke again, the sleep was entirely gone from his voice. "What do you need me to do?" "To the world, Harrison Caldwell is dead," I told him, gripping the phone cord tight. "Let us keep it that way for a few days. Bring your truck to the loading dock at the back of the hospital. Bring your encrypted laptop. We have work to do." Discharging myself against medical advice was one of the most agonizing physical experiences of my entire 68 years on this earth. The night shift doctor threatened to call hospital security. He told me my surgical stitches could tear, that I could bleed out in the back of a car, that my blood pressure was dangerously unstable. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that if I stayed in this hospital, my own family would make sure I left in a body bag. I signed the liability waivers with a shaking hand. A sympathetic nurse, the same one who had shown me the forged legal document, quietly packed me a small bag of heavy antibiotics and fresh medical bandages. She did not ask any questions. She just looked at me with deep sorrow and wished me luck. I limped out through the service elevator corridors, clutching my side every single step, sending white-hot flares of pain through my ribs. The cold night air hit my face as the heavy metal doors of the loading dock pushed open. Sullivan was waiting right there in his beat-up 1998 Ford pickup truck. The engine was idling quietly. He stepped out, took one look at my pale, sweating face, and helped me into the passenger seat without a single word. We drove to a cheap run-down motel on the industrial edge of town, far away from the affluent suburban neighborhoods where Preston and Jessica were currently sleeping comfortably in my house. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. The wallpaper was peeling in the humid corners. It was a massive drop from the comfortable custom-built home I had provided for my family, but right now, it was the perfect command center. It was entirely off the grid. Sullivan set up his heavy laptop on the small, wobbly veneer desk. He pulled out a thermos of black coffee and handed me a plastic cup. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth ground me. I gave him the administrative access codes to my home network and my primary banking servers. "They think I am a dinosaur, Sully," I said, leaning back against the stiff motel headboard, pressing a firm hand to my aching side. "They think because I wore a hard hat my whole life, I do not understand digital banking or secure networks. They forgot that I built the data centers that house these very servers." Sullivan's fingers flew across the keyboard. We started pulling the financial logs from my primary trust accounts, the commercial real estate holdings, and the union pension funds I had secured over 4 decades of brutal physical labor. I fully expected to see that Preston had initiated the transfers tonight, right after he declared me dead to his wealthy friends. But as the encrypted bank statements populated on the glowing screen, the true sickening depth of the rot was laid bare. This was not a sudden crime of opportunity. Preston and Uncle Frank had not just been waiting for me to die. They had been actively bleeding my accounts for 3 entire years. "Look at this routing history, Harrison," Sullivan muttered, pointing a thick finger at a series of massive, repetitive withdrawals. "These are structured shell transfers. They have been siphoning $50,000 at a time, routing it directly through Frank's auto dealership limited liability companies as fake independent contracting fees." My chest tightened, restricting my breath. Frank, my late wife's older brother, the man who sat crying at Barbara's funeral holding my hand and promising we would always be family. The man I had fed at my Thanksgiving dinner table for 30 straight years. He was the chief architect of the laundering scheme. We dug much deeper. I owned 3 prime commercial properties, downtown, large brick buildings I had bought cheap in the 80s and completely rewired and renovated myself. They were my absolute legacy, the financial safety net that was supposed to guarantee my grandchildren would never have to struggle. Sullivan opened the title deeds registered with the county clerk database. My breath caught in my throat. Preston had expertly forged my signature to take out massive equity loans against every single one of those commercial properties. He had leveraged my life's work to the absolute brink of foreclosure. The fraudulent loans totaled over $2.5 million. And the money had vanished straight into offshore holding accounts managed entirely by Frank. They had stolen my past. They were draining my present, and they had completely mortgaged away the future. They were living like royalty, driving luxury cars, taking lavish tropical vacations, and buying elite country club memberships, all financed by the quiet, methodical destruction of my life. I had trusted my son with limited access to manage the property taxes while I grieved for Barbara. He had used that key to open the vault and let the wolves inside. We needed more than just bank statements to put them behind bars for maximum federal sentences. We needed documented, undeniable intent. We needed the communications that proved they coordinated this massive fraud. Sullivan bypassed Preston's personal email security using a brute force software script he kept on a flash drive, a brilliant trick left over from his days busting corrupt corporate contractors. At 3 in the morning, the inbox cracked open. We began filtering the emails by specific keywords. Estate inheritance. Frank offshore assets. Dozens of highly incriminating threads popped up immediately. There were emails between Preston and Frank discussing the absolute best offshore tax havens. There were emails detailing exactly how to keep the equity loans hidden from my quarterly mail statements by intercepting the physical mail at the local post office. But it was a hidden, permanently deleted chain between Preston and his wife Jessica that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Sullivan clicked on an email thread dated from just yesterday afternoon, exactly 2 hours after my severe accident. Exactly the time I was fighting for my life in the hospital trauma bay. The email was sent directly from Jessica's phone to Preston. I leaned forward completely, ignoring the burning pain in my surgical wounds, and read the words glowing harshly on the laptop screen. Jessica wrote, "Preston Frank just called. He said the old man's accident is incredibly bad, but he might actually pull through if they find a rapid blood match. You absolutely cannot go down to that hospital today. If the old man survives this accident, we lose the country club membership and the yacht. Frank says the equity loans are due for a massive balloon payment next month. We will go completely bankrupt and face an audit. Make sure the hospital knows he didn't want life support. Sign whatever you have to sign to end this tonight." Preston's reply was sent exactly 3 minutes later. It consisted of one single ice-cold sentence. "Already faxed the DNR. Pour the scotch. We are free." I sat back in the cheap motel chair, the silence of the room becoming utterly deafening. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow to the jaw. My son did not just ignore a medical emergency out of mere greed or casual negligence. This was not just a case of a spoiled, selfish child failing to step up. They desperately needed the balloon payments covered by my life insurance policies and the immediate liquidation of my estate. My physical survival meant their absolute financial ruin and the total exposure of a 3-year, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. They had actively, willingly, and excitedly conspired to let me bleed to death to cover their criminal tracks. They didn't just ignore my emergency. They actively tried to commit premeditated medical manslaughter. I looked over at Sullivan. His face was pale, his jaw set in a hard, rigid line of pure disgust. He closed the laptop screen slightly and looked straight at me. "Harrison," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "This is not just corporate theft anymore. This is an active murder plot." I stood up slowly from the chair. The pain in my side was a roaring, agonizing fire, but I welcomed it. It kept me remarkably sharp. It kept me highly focused. The man who had unconditionally loved his son, the man who had grieved heavily for his wife and tried to keep his extended family together, died on that cold operating table yesterday. The man standing in this motel room was a master electrician who was about to overload their entire fraudulent system, print every single page Sully. I said, my voice echoing coldly in the dingy room. "We are going to let them think they won. We are going to let them dig their own graves so deep that not even the devil can hear them scream." The glow of the laptop screen cast long, harsh shadows across Sullivan's face in that cramped motel room. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and stared at the financial routing numbers. The sheer magnitude of the theft was staggering, but it was the destination of the stolen funds that made my blood run entirely cold. Uncle Frank, my late wife's older brother, the man who stood beside me at Barbara's grave, weeping and swearing that we would always look out for each other. My mind drifted back through 30 years of memories. Frank was a man who always possessed grand ambitions, but completely lacked the work ethic to back them up. He ran a string of auto dealerships on the east side of the city. Every few years, he would run his business straight into the ground. And every single time, I was the one who pulled him out of the wreckage. I lent him hundreds of thousands of dollars over the decades. I paid his overdue property taxes to keep his lots from being seized by the county. I did it because Barbara loved him, and I believed that family was the most sacred bond a man could have. I gave him a lifeline. In return, he used that lifeline to strangle me. Sullivan scrolled through the bank ledgers, his thick fingers tapping heavily on the keyboard. He pointed out a complex web of limited liability companies and dummy corporate accounts. Frank was not just a passive participant in this scheme. He was the absolute mastermind. Preston, for all his arrogant, polished corporate auditor persona, was just a greedy kid who lacked the nerve to pull off a multi-million-dollar embezzlement operation on his own. Frank had recognized my son's moral weakness and exploited it. Frank set up the shell companies. Frank drafted the fraudulent equity loans against my commercial properties. Frank had engineered the entire laundering process, using his failing auto dealerships to wash the stolen pension funds and make them look like legitimate vehicle sales and contractor fees. They had been actively bleeding my trust accounts dry for 3 solid years. But the paper trail we found on the laptop was only a digital footprint. Sullivan turned to me with a hard, uncompromising look in his eyes. He said that a clever defense attorney could argue that the digital files were hacked or manipulated. If we wanted to put them away in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives, we needed the physical proof. We needed the hard ledgers, the original forged signatures, and the physical banking tokens. We needed to go straight into the belly of the beast. We needed to break into Frank's flagship dealership. It was exactly 2 in the morning when Sullivan parked his old beat-up truck in a dark alley a block away from Frank's main auto lot. The city was completely silent, buried under a heavy blanket of cold night air. Every time I took a breath, the fresh surgical stitches across my abdomen screamed in agonizing protest. The physical pain was a roaring fire in my ribs, but the righteous anger burning in my heart was infinitely stronger. I zipped up my dark canvas work jacket and grabbed a heavy leather tool bag from the back seat of the truck. We walked through the shadows, avoiding the amber glow of the streetlights. We approached the rear service entrance of the dealership. Frank had recently updated his security grid. A bright red light blinked rhythmically above the heavy steel door, indicating a commercial-grade alarm system. Sullivan looked at the keypad and then looked at me. He whispered that we had less than a few minutes before a patrol car swung by on its routine route. I stepped up to the metal door. I am a master electrician. For 40 years, I designed, installed, and diagnosed the most complex power grids in the entire state. A standard commercial alarm system is nothing but a simple circuit of resistance and ground wires. I pulled a flathead screwdriver and a pair of insulated wire strippers from my bag. My hands were heavily calloused and scarred from decades of pulling copper wire. They did not shake at all. I slid the screwdriver under the plastic housing of the alarm module and popped the cover loose. A tangle of green, yellow, and red wires spilled out into the dim moonlight. I identified the main communication line and the tamper switch immediately. I pulled a small, heavy gauge jumper wire from my pocket. I spliced the ends with my teeth, tasting the familiar bitter tang of copper. With absolute practiced precision, I bridged the main circuit, creating a continuous loop that bypassed the door sensor entirely. The red light on the keypad flickered once, and then turned a steady, solid green. The system believed the door was perfectly secure. I turned the heavy metal handle and pushed the door open. The entire bypass had taken me exactly 1 minute and 45 seconds. We stepped into the dark, silent service bay. The smell of motor oil rubber and cheap pine air freshener hung heavy in the stagnant air. We moved like shadows through the rows of parked cars, heading straight for the executive offices at the front of the building. My side throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, but I forced my legs to keep moving forward. I was a dead man walking, and I was coming to collect my dues. Frank's office was located behind a frosted glass door. We slipped inside and closed the blinds tightly. Sullivan pulled a small, focused beam flashlight from his pocket and swept it across the room. The office reeked of cheap cologne and expensive cigars. The desk was covered in glossy sales brochures and empty liquor glasses. But we were not interested in the desk. Sullivan moved the heavy leather armchair and pulled back a thick, ugly Persian rug in the corner of the room. There it was, a heavy industrial-grade floor safe embedded directly into the concrete foundation. It featured a modern digital keypad lock. Frank always loved to show off his expensive gadgets. Sullivan looked at the safe and let out a low, frustrated breath. He told me that a brute force crack on a digital lock could take hours, and a drilling operation would wake up the entire neighborhood. I knelt down beside the safe, gritting my teeth against the searing pain in my stomach. I looked closely at the electronic lock casing. I asked Sullivan to shine the light directly on the hinges. The lock operated on a magnetic solenoid mechanism powered by an internal battery pack. If you overload the circuitry, the fail-safe mechanism forces the solenoid to retract and release the locking bolts. I pulled a portable high-voltage electrical tester from my tool bag. I jammed the metal prongs deeply into the small key override slot, finding the bare communication pins. I triggered a massive surge of stored electricity directly into the circuit board. The keypad sparked briefly, let out a sharp beep, and then the heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying thud. Sullivan let out a low whistle of sheer respect. We pulled the heavy door wide open and reached inside. The safe was packed with thick, leather-bound ledger books, stacks of duplicate bank statements, and heavy plastic folders. We hauled everything out onto the floor and began to sort through the documents under the narrow beam of the flashlight. The evidence was absolutely damning. Here were the physical original copies of the fraudulent equity loans Preston had taken out against my commercial properties. Here were the offshore routing tokens and the signed corporate manifests proving Frank was washing the money through his dealership accounts. They had documented their own crimes with staggering arrogance, believing they were entirely untouchable. But as I dug deeper into the back of the safe, my fingers brushed against a stiff manila envelope marked with a bright red medical seal. I pulled it out and opened the metal clasp. I slid the crisp white paper out into the light. My heart completely stopped in my chest. It was a certificate of death. It was an official state-issued legal document declaring Harrison Caldwell deceased. It listed my full legal name, my social security number, and my date of birth. But it was the details at the bottom of the page that made the blood roar in my ears. The document was already signed by a county coroner, complete with an official medical examiner stamp. I looked at the date of death listed on the certificate. It was dated for the exact day of my construction site accident. It was dated for yesterday. The sheer horrifying reality of the document washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. This was not a reactive crime. They had not just taken advantage of a tragic accident. You do not get a forged, officially stamped coroner's certificate on a whim. This required massive premeditation. It required bribes coordination and weeks of careful planning. They had this document prepared and ready to go long before the winch line ever snapped and tore my chest open. I stared at the forged signature, my breathing growing shallow and fast. Had the accident truly been an accident at all? I was the one who inspected that heavy machinery the day before. The cables were structurally sound. Someone had to have intentionally compromised the steel winch line, knowing I would be standing directly in the swing path. My own son and my brother-in-law had actively planned my murder. And when the accident failed to kill me instantly, Preston had stepped in to finish the job with the forged "Do Not Resuscitate" order. "Harrison!" Sullivan whispered urgently, pulling me out of my dark, spiraling thoughts. "Look at this." He was holding a stack of external hard drives he had pulled from the very bottom of the safe. These contained the raw, unedited digital backups of the dealership's server. Every single email, every transaction, every deleted message was archived right here. Sullivan quickly plugged a heavy data transfer cable from the drives directly into his encrypted laptop. A green progress bar appeared on the screen, slowly filling up as the massive files began to copy over. "This transfer is going to take exactly 4 minutes," Sullivan said, his eyes glued to the loading bar. "Once we have this data, we have them completely dead to rights. They will never see the outside of a prison cell again." I packed the physical ledgers and the forged death certificate tightly into my leather tool bag. Every single piece of paper felt incredibly heavy, weighed down by the crushing reality of my family's ultimate betrayal. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the glowing green bar on the laptop screen. It hit 50%, then 60%. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the night was shattered by the harsh, grinding sound of tires crunching on loose gravel. Sullivan and I instantly froze. We held our breath, listening intently to the sounds echoing from the alleyway behind the building. Bright, sweeping beams of yellow headlights flashed across the frosted glass windows of the office, casting long, frantic shadows against the far wall. A vehicle had just pulled directly into the private rear loading bay. The engine of the car was abruptly cut off. A heavy car door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet, empty dealership. Sullivan quickly shut off his flashlight, plunging the office back into total darkness. The green loading bar on the laptop screen was at 80%. We could not unplug the hard drive now without permanently corrupting the transfer and losing the digital evidence forever. We heard the distinct jingle of heavy brass keys outside the rear service door. Then the heavy metallic clank of a deadbolt sliding open. Someone was inside the building. I moved silently to the frosted glass window of the office and peered through a tiny gap in the vertical blinds. The dim, yellowish glow of a street lamp outside illuminated the main service corridor. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed across the polished concrete floor, moving directly toward the executive office wing. A figure stepped into the pale light. It was Frank. My brother-in-law looked completely unhinged. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit. He was wearing baggy sweatpants and a dark hooded sweatshirt. His face was pale, sweating profusely, and his eyes darted around the room with wild, desperate paranoia. But it was not his face that made my pulse pound in my throat. It was what he was carrying in his hands. In his left hand, Frank held a massive industrial-grade paper shredder, the kind used to destroy heavy plastic credit cards and thick legal binders. In his right hand, he carried a large red metal can of highly flammable lighter fluid. He had come to destroy the evidence. He had panicked in the middle of the night, realizing the extreme risk of leaving the physical ledgers in the safe, while the hospital delayed issuing my official death certificate. He was planning to shred the documents, pour lighter fluid inside the heavy steel safe, and burn the remnants to ash. The green loading bar on Sullivan's laptop hit 92%. It was moving agonizingly slow. Frank's heavy footsteps grew louder, closer, and more aggressive. He marched straight down the hallway, breathing heavily, muttering frantic, panicked curses under his breath. He stopped directly outside the frosted glass door of the office. Sullivan and I stood trapped in the pitch-black room. There was no secondary exit. There were no windows we could open. We were completely boxed in. I watched through the narrow slit in the blinds as Frank shifted the heavy shredder under his arm. He reached his free hand forward. I saw his sweaty fingers wrap tightly around the brass handle of the office door. The metal latch clicked loudly in the silent room. The handle began to turn. The heavy brass handle of the office door began to turn. I did not panic. 40 years working as a master electrician teaches you to respect live electrical currents, but it also teaches you never to fear them. Sullivan froze completely still, his eyes wide in the suffocating darkness of the room. The laptop screen cast a faint, ghostly green glow across his face as the data transfer hit 98%. Frank was pushing his considerable weight against the heavy wood, muttering desperate, panicked curses under his breath. The entire hallway reeked of stale sweat and the sharp chemical stench of the lighter fluid he was carrying. I dropped instantly to one knee. My calloused fingers traced the wooden baseboard along the wall until they found exactly what I was looking for. Every single commercial office building constructed in the 1980s featured external conduit lines running along the perimeter of the executive wing. I reached into my heavy leather tool bag and pulled out my insulated wire strippers. I dug the sharp metal jaws directly into the plastic track, exposing the main alternating current lines that fed power to the entire floor. Frank shoved his shoulder hard against the door, the metal latch groaning under the immense pressure. The green progress bar on Sullivan's laptop finally hit 99%. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I gripped the thick, live copper wires and crossed them forcefully against the grounded steel frame of Frank's massive executive desk. A brilliant, blinding flash of blue and white sparks erupted violently from the wall. The sharp, explosive crack of a catastrophic electrical overload echoed like a shotgun blast in the confined space. The main breaker panel for the entire commercial building tripped instantly. The executive office, the long hallway, the massive vehicle showroom, the entire sprawling dealership was suddenly plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. Frank screamed in pure, unadulterated shock. I heard the heavy metal can of lighter fluid slip from his grasp and crash onto the floor, the toxic liquid spilling rapidly across the carpet. At that exact moment, the faint green bar on Sullivan's laptop hit 100% so. The screen went entirely black as Sullivan slammed the lid shut with a satisfying snap. We had the data. I grabbed my tool bag and gripped Sullivan tightly by the shoulder. We moved blindly, but we moved with absolute calculated purpose. Frank was thrashing around in the pitch-black hallway, cursing wildly, frantically, fumbling with his pockets to find his cell phone flashlight. He was completely disoriented by the sudden explosive darkness. We slipped silently out the side door of the office, our heavy work boots completely silent on the concrete floor. We bypassed his thrashing figure by mere inches. I could feel the heat radiating from his panicked body. We hit the rear service bay doors, pushed the heavy metal release bar, and burst out into the freezing night air. We jumped into the cab of Sullivan's beat-up truck. He turned the ignition key, the old engine roaring to life with a fierce rumble. We tore out of the narrow dirt alleyway, keeping the headlights completely off until we hit the main commercial avenue. I sat back heavily against the torn fabric passenger seat, my chest heaving, the surgical stitches across my abdomen burning like a hot branding iron. But I had the physical financial ledgers secured tightly in my bag, and Sullivan had the entire digital server copied onto his encrypted hard drive. We had completely outsmarted him. Frank was standing entirely alone in the dark with a useless industrial shredder and a massive puddle of highly flammable liquid. But the job was far from finished. We had secured the financial records, but we desperately needed the legal linchpin. We needed the original notarized power of attorney documents that Preston was currently using to authorize the aggressive liquidation of my entire estate. I knew exactly where my son kept his highly secure files. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, Sullivan parked his old truck 3 blocks away from my property. We sat in the cold, unheated cab, drinking bitter black coffee from a corner convenience store, watching the heavy wrought iron front gates through a pair of high-powered binoculars. Sullivan warned me that if I was caught on the property, Preston could use the trespassing to reinforce his fake narrative of my mental instability. I told him I did not care about the risks. I needed the final nails for their coffin. Exactly on schedule. Preston's sleek silver luxury sedan pulled slowly out of the long driveway. He and Jessica were dressed in incredibly sharp, high-end business attire. They were heading downtown to meet with top-tier commercial real estate brokers to put a massive price tag on my life's work. The absolute arrogance of it all made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. I waited 10 full minutes to ensure they were completely out of the neighborhood. I stepped out of the truck. The morning air was crisp, cold, and biting. I walked down the familiar, beautifully tree-lined sidewalk of my own suburban neighborhood, pulling the brim of my worn canvas cap low over my eyes to avoid the gaze of any early morning dog walkers. It is a profoundly disturbing, psychologically jarring experience to approach your own house feeling like a wanted criminal. I had personally built the tall brick retaining walls surrounding the garden. I had planted the massive oak trees in the front yard with my late wife Barbara over 30 years ago. Now I was sneaking quietly through the side gate, like a common thief in the broad daylight. I walked up the stone steps to the back patio door. The expensive smart security system I had meticulously wired was currently disabled, completely blinded thanks to the administrative backdoor access I maintained on Sullivan's laptop. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass house key. It slid into the deadbolt perfectly. The lock clicked heavily, and I pushed the solid wooden door open. I stepped inside the foyer, and the absolute silence of the house hit me like a massive physical blow to the chest. It no longer felt like my home. The warm, inviting smell of Barbara's favorite cinnamon candles and the faint, comforting scent of my old pipe tobacco were entirely gone. They had been aggressively replaced by the sharp, sterile, overpowering scent of expensive chemical air fresheners. I walked slowly into the main living room, my boots echoing loudly on the rich hardwood floors I had painstakingly sanded, stained, and polished with my own 2 hands. My breath caught violently in my throat. Everything that made this massive house a warm living home had been systematically and ruthlessly erased. The vintage, comfortable floral armchairs that Barbara absolutely loved reading in were completely gone, replaced by cold, soulless, gray, modern furniture that looked like it belonged in a corporate waiting room. The beautiful hand-stitched curtains she had spent weeks sewing were torn down. But the most devastating, agonizing insult of all was the large stone fireplace mantel. For 40 years, that mantel had held our entire family history. It held the framed photographs of our wedding day pictures of Preston taking his very first steps as a baby, decades of joyful holiday cards, and the beautiful engraved silver clock I had proudly bought Barbara for our 25th wedding anniversary. The mantel was now completely bare. A massive, ostentatious piece of abstract modern art hung coldly in its place. I turned my head toward the formal dining room and saw 3 large, heavy cardboard moving boxes shoved carelessly into the dark corner. I walked over with heavy steps and pulled back the folded cardboard flaps. Inside, tossed roughly like worthless, forgotten garbage, were all of Barbara's beautifully framed photographs. Her bright, smiling face, captured perfectly on our family road trip to the Grand Canyon, was pressed hard against the bottom of the box under a heavy pile of old tax forms and junk mail. They could not even wait until my supposed funeral was over to aggressively erase her beautiful memory from this earth. They threw her away the exact second they thought my heart had stopped beating on that operating table. The profound, sickening disrespect was a jagged blade twisting deep in my gut. They did not just want my millions of dollars. They wanted to obliterate my entire existence. They wanted a clean, sterile slate funded entirely by my blood and 40 years of sweat. The overwhelming sorrow I felt looking into that cardboard box quickly hardened into pure, unbreakable frozen steel. I gently took Barbara's photograph out of the trash box, wiped the dust from the glass, and placed it carefully back on the center of the dining table. I whispered a quiet, absolute promise to her empty frame. I promised her I would not let these monsters win. I turned away from the dining room and marched straight down the long hallway toward Preston's sprawling home office. The heavy wooden door was securely locked, but a standard interior tumbler mechanism is absolutely no match for a seasoned master electrician equipped with a basic tension wrench. I popped the lock mechanism effortlessly in under 5 seconds and stepped confidently inside. The room was immaculate, lined with heavy mahogany bookshelves, and dominated by a massive glass executive desk. I walked straight over to the locked metal filing cabinet sitting in the corner. I pulled a small steel pry bar from my jacket pocket and forced the top drawer violently open. Inside, meticulously organized in thick green hanging folders, was the entire legal architecture of their treasonous plot. I quickly pulled out the original heavily stamped power of attorney forms. I found the forged commercial property deeds, the pre-drafted real estate listing contracts, and the highly illegal offshore wire transfer authorizations that were ready to be aggressively deployed the absolute minute the hospital officially released my body to the morgue. I laid all the damning documents out flat across the smooth glass desk. I pulled a small, untraceable burner phone from my pocket, a device provided by Sullivan specifically for this operation. I began rapidly snapping high-resolution photographs of every single page, capturing every forged signature, every fraudulent date, and every single damning piece of ink. We had them completely cornered. The legal trap was now fully armed and heavily loaded. But just as I aligned the camera lens to snap the photograph of the final massive bank transfer document, the small burner phone vibrated violently in the palm of my hand. The screen lit up instantly with an incoming call. The caller ID showed a blocked, untraceable number, but I had specifically routed the emergency contact line from the hospital directly to this secured device. I answered the call, immediately pressing the phone tight against my ear. It was the sympathetic night shift nurse. Her voice was incredibly frantic, breathless, and laced with absolute terror. She told me she was currently hiding inside a locked medical supply closet on the surgical floor. She whispered sharply that I needed to be incredibly careful, that the situation had just escalated drastically. Preston had just stormed through the main sliding doors of the hospital lobby. He was standing aggressively at the front administrative desk, right at this exact moment, flanked tightly by a massive, highly intimidating corporate attorney. He was screaming loudly at the hospital administration staff, threatening a massive multi-million-dollar malpractice lawsuit if they did not immediately release my remains to his custody. The hospital staff was panicking wildly because they could not locate me anywhere in the recovery ward. Preston was demanding to see my dead body. He was mere minutes away from discovering that the hospital bed was entirely empty. The medical machines were unhooked, and his supposedly dead father was currently standing inside his own house. I slipped out the back door of my own home, just as the burner phone in my hand went completely silent. Preston was miles away at the hospital, screaming at the administrative staff, furiously demanding to see a dead body that did not exist. I walked rapidly down the tree-lined sidewalk, my boots hitting the concrete with a heavy rhythmic thud. The physical pain in my stitched abdomen was a blinding fire, but my mind was completely clear. I had the photographic evidence of his forged documents securely saved on my phone. I met Sullivan back at his idling truck 3 blocks away. I climbed into the passenger seat, slammed the heavy metal door, and told him to drive. I told Sullivan that we had everything we needed to prove their guilt, but I did not just want my money back. I did not want a quiet settlement or a messy family court dispute. I wanted Preston Jessica and Uncle Frank completely obliterated. I wanted them destroyed legally, financially, and publicly. I wanted every single person in their wealthy, pretentious social circle to know exactly what kind of monsters they truly were. Sullivan gripped the steering wheel tightly and nodded his head. He told me that if I wanted absolute destruction, we needed an executioner. We needed Elias Montgomery. Elias Montgomery was widely known as the most ruthless corporate litigator in the entire state. He was a man who made his living dismantling corrupt executives and tearing apart fraudulent companies piece by piece. Sullivan had worked with him years ago during a massive union pension dispute, and he swore the man possessed the instincts of a starving shark. We drove straight to the financial district and parked outside a towering glass and steel skyscraper. We took the private elevator up to the top floor. Montgomery's office was a massive, intimidating space filled with rich mahogany bookshelves and dark leather furniture. Montgomery sat behind a sprawling desk wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first truck. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp, calculating eyes and a demeanor that commanded instant respect. He looked at my worn canvas jacket, my pale, sweating face, and the heavy leather tool bag in my hands. He did not judge me. He simply offered us a seat and poured 2 glasses of cold water. I sat down heavily in the leather chair. I did not waste his time with tears or long, emotional complaints. I spoke to him with the precise, methodical language of a master electrician laying out a catastrophic grid failure. I opened the laptop and showed him the digital server files we had extracted from Frank's dealership. I showed him the offshore routing numbers and the fake consulting invoices. Then I placed my burner phone on his desk and displayed the high-resolution photographs I had just taken inside Preston's study. The forged property deeds, the illegal asset transfers, and finally the pre-dated officially stamped death certificate bearing my name. Montgomery sat in absolute silence as he reviewed the evidence. His eyes scanned every single document, every forged signature, every single line of the illicit bank transfers. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the office was the quiet ticking of a heavy brass clock on his wall. When he finally finished, he leaned back in his big leather chair. A slow, terrifying, entirely predatory smile spread across his face. He looked at me and said that my son and my brother-in-law had built an incredibly arrogant, sloppy criminal enterprise, but he warned me that we had to be incredibly strategic about our next move. Montgomery explained the legal reality of our situation. He told me that if we walked into a police precinct today and slammed these documents on the desk, Preston and Frank would certainly be arrested. However, they would immediately hire high-priced criminal defense attorneys using my stolen money. They would claim the offshore accounts were legitimate business investments that I had verbally approved before my accident. They would argue that the forged documents were a tragic misunderstanding born out of the grief of losing a father. They would drag the case through the state court system for years. They might end up serving a few meager months in a minimum security county jail, and they would likely hide a massive portion of the stolen funds before the authorities could freeze the accounts. I looked at Montgomery and told him that a slap on the wrist was entirely unacceptable. I told him I wanted them to lose everything. Montgomery's smile grew wider. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany desk. He told me that if we wanted to guarantee they spent decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary, we could not stop them right now. We had to let them cross the line of no return. We had to let them trigger federal jurisdiction. He explained that state-level forgery and local embezzlement were serious, but federal wire fraud and grand larceny carried mandatory minimum sentences that would completely ruin their lives. We needed them to willingly use an electronic communication network to transmit the forged death certificate in an attempt to steal a massive life-altering sum of money. We needed to set a trap so lucrative, so undeniably tempting, that their own blinding greed would override any sense of caution. Montgomery turned to his computer and began typing with lightning speed. He told me we were going to invent a ghost. Over the next 2 hours, Montgomery used his vast legal resources to draft a completely fictitious, highly official-looking legal portfolio. He created a dummy holding company registered out of Delaware. He drafted a magnificent, incredibly complex document titled A Final Disbursement Notification. This document indicated that I, Harrison Caldwell, had secretly liquidated a massive portion of my early commercial real estate investments decades ago and placed the funds into a highly secure blind trust. According to the paperwork Montgomery drafted, this hidden asset was worth exactly $5 million in pure liquid cash. The trap was beautifully simple and utterly devastating. The fake document stated that these funds were scheduled to be released to my designated heir upon the immediate event of my passing. However, because the trust was protected under strict federal banking regulations, the money could not be dispersed automatically. The designated executor of my estate, which Preston believed he was, had to formally claim the funds. To do so, Preston would have to sign a sworn federal affidavit under penalty of perjury. He would have to attach my official death certificate and formally declare to the federal government that I was deceased and that he was legally entitled to the money. If Preston signed that document and submitted it across state lines, He would be committing massive federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and federal perjury all in one single stroke of a pen. It was the legal equivalent of handing a man a loaded grenade and asking him to pull the pin. I stared at the pristine, terrifyingly official documents printing out of Montgomery's laser printer. My heart felt heavy, burdened by the profound tragedy of the situation. I was setting a trap to send my only child to federal prison for a very long time. I thought about the little boy I used to carry on my shoulders at the county fair. I thought about the teenager I had proudly taught to drive in empty parking lots. But then I remembered the cold, callous sound of his voice on the hospital phone. I remembered him complaining about a networking party while my chest was torn open and I was begging for my life. I remembered the vile, greedy toast he gave on my own patio, celebrating my demise while drinking my expensive scotch. That little boy was entirely gone. He had been replaced by a ruthless, empty shell of a man who viewed my life as nothing more than an ATM. I looked at Montgomery and gave him a firm, decisive nod. I told him to bait the hook. Montgomery scanned the fake final disbursement documents into his computer. He attached a formal, highly professional legal cover letter addressed directly to Preston's consulting firm email. The letter introduced Elias Montgomery as an independent fiduciary attorney tasked with locating the surviving heirs of the Caldwell Holding Trust. It requested an immediate meeting to finalize the transfer of the $5 million asset pending the submission of the required federal affidavits and the official certificate of death. Montgomery utilized a specialized legal software that tracked exact email analytics. He wanted to know the precise second Preston opened the message where he was located and exactly how long he spent reading the bait. Montgomery pressed the send button. The office fell into a thick, suffocating silence. Sullivan paced slowly near the large windows, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, ignoring the throbbing pain in my side. We stared intensely at the secondary monitor on Montgomery's desk. The screen displayed a simple digital status bar waiting for a read receipt. This was the ultimate test of my son's character. Preston was currently at the hospital. He had just been informed that my body was entirely missing from the recovery ward. A normal, loving son would be terrified. A normal son would be calling the police, frantically searching the hospital corridors, desperate to find his injured, missing father. He would be completely consumed by panic and confusion. 10 minutes passed. The digital tracker remained blank. 15 minutes passed. I felt a tiny, fragile sliver of hope bloom in the darkest corner of my chest. Maybe, just maybe, Preston was actually looking for me. Maybe he was currently demanding answers from the hospital security team. Maybe his greed had not completely extinguished his humanity. At exactly 22 minutes past the hour, the computer speaker emitted a sharp, loud chime. The digital tracker on the screen flipped from unread to opened. The IP location pinged directly to a cell tower located just outside the main entrance of City General Hospital. Preston was standing in the hospital parking lot, having just discovered his father was missing, and he was currently checking his business emails on his phone. We watched the analytics tracker in real time. The software indicated that Preston spent exactly 4 minutes reading the document. He was digesting the words. He was reading the staggering figure of $5 million. He was calculating the sheer, overwhelming amount of wealth suddenly dangling right in front of his face. My breathing grew shallow. I prayed silently that he would stop. I prayed he would realize the absolute absurdity of the situation and go back inside the hospital to search for his father. Another sharp chime echoed through the quiet office. Preston had sent a reply. Montgomery clicked open the email and read the text aloud, his voice devoid of any emotion. Preston wrote, "Mr. Montgomery, thank you for reaching out during this incredibly difficult time for my family. As the sole executor of my late father's estate, I am fully prepared to execute the necessary federal affidavits and provide the required documentation immediately. Please let me know your earliest availability. We can meet at my uncle's auto dealership boardroom tomorrow morning to sign the paperwork. The fragile sliver of hope inside my chest shattered into 1,000 tiny, jagged pieces. The absolute blinding greed had won. My son did not care that my body was missing. He did not care about the bizarre circumstances at the hospital. The promise of $5 million had completely consumed his mind. He was fully prepared to double down on his lies, swear a fraudulent oath to the federal government, and seal his own absolute destruction just to get his hands on a phantom fortune. He had eagerly, willingly, and happily stepped right onto the landmine. Montgomery leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together in a steeple. He looked at Sullivan, then he looked directly at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely victorious. Montgomery said, "The trap is set, Harrison. I will confirm the meeting for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We are going to let them sign their own federal prison sentences in permanent ink." I stood up slowly from the leather chair. The pain in my abdomen was a dull, distant hum compared to the roaring electrical fire burning in my soul. I adjusted my canvas jacket and looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling city below. I had spent 40 years building the infrastructure of this town. I knew how to build things up, and I certainly knew how to tear them completely down. Tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into that boardroom, flip the master breaker, and plunge their entire corrupt, greedy world into permanent darkness. The Oak Ridge Country Club was a place I had never stepped foot in during my entire 68 years of life. I was a man who belonged on construction sites, breathing in the smell of raw concrete ozone and hot copper wire. I spent 40 years eating cold sandwiches out of a metal lunchbox while sitting on steel girders. I did not belong in rooms with vaulted ceilings, imported crystal chandeliers, and floors made of polished Italian marble. Yet here I was, walking through the grand ballroom of the most exclusive club in the city, attending my own memorial service. My disguise was simple, but incredibly effective. An old friend from the electrical union had a nephew who managed the catering staff for the club. When Sullivan explained that we needed a way inside without raising any alarms, the kid handed over a spare uniform without asking a single question. I wore crisp black trousers, a starched white button-down shirt, and a black silk vest. I wore thick, dark-rimmed glasses I had bought at a corner pharmacy. I kept my head down, blending perfectly into the background. It is a harsh reality of this world that wealthy people never truly look at the faces of the people serving them. To the elite crowd gathered in that room, I was completely invisible. I was just another pair of hands holding a silver tray. Every single step I took sent a blinding, white-hot spike of agony through my abdomen. The heavy surgical stitches holding my torn chest together pulled tight against the starched fabric of the uniform. I had to focus all my willpower just to keep my hands from shaking. I gripped the edges of the silver tray loaded with expensive champagne flutes and forced myself to walk smoothly through the crowd. This was supposed to be a celebration of life. It was supposed to be a solemn gathering to honor a father, a husband, and a master electrician who had allegedly died in a tragic accident. But as I moved through the room, the absolute sickness of the event became overwhelmingly clear. It was not a memorial. It was a high-end corporate networking event. Preston and Uncle Frank had not invited my union brothers. They had not invited the men I had trained or the neighbors I had known for 30 years. Instead, the ballroom was packed with commercial real estate developers, investment bankers, and local politicians. The room was filled with the low, buzzing hum of people discussing stock portfolios, golf handicaps, and offshore tax havens. They were clinking crystal glasses and laughing heartily. They were entirely unbothered by the fact that they were supposedly standing in the shadow of a tragedy. I walked past a long, velvet-draped table near the entrance. My stomach churned violently when I saw what was resting on it. There were stacks of glossy, professionally printed brochures. The front cover featured a photograph of me in my hard hat, standing in front of a commercial power grid I had wired a decade ago. The bold gold lettering across the top read, "The Harrison Caldwell Memorial Foundation." I picked up one of the brochures and read the fine print. Preston and Frank had created a fictitious charitable fund, claiming it was designed to provide vocational scholarships for young tradesmen. But the routing information at the bottom of the page directed all donations straight into a private corporate account managed entirely by Preston's consulting firm. They were actively exploiting my blue-collar image. They were using the respect I had built over 40 years of brutal, honest labor to solicit sympathy investments from wealthy donors. They were stealing from the rich by parading the corpse of a working-class father. I placed the brochure back on the table and picked up my tray of champagne. I moved deeper into the crowd, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Taped securely to my chest right next to my medical bandages was a high-fidelity digital audio recorder provided by Sullivan. I was capturing every single whisper, every laugh, and every fraudulent promise echoing in that room. I approached a small circle of guests standing near the grand piano. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, was the absolute center of attention. She was wearing a stunning form-fitting black evening gown that looked like it had come straight off a runway in Paris. She threw her head back, laughing a sharp, piercing laugh at a joke a real estate broker had just made. As I stepped closer to offer them beverages, the light from the chandelier caught her throat. Resting heavily on her collarbone was a massive, intricate diamond necklace. The stones caught the light and threw fractured rainbows across the room. I knew exactly what that necklace was. Sullivan and I had seen the digital receipt on the stolen bank ledgers just hours ago. It was a custom piece that cost exactly $40,000. She had purchased it using the cash they had illegally drained from my commercial property equity loans. She was proudly wearing my retirement fund around her neck at a party celebrating my death. I stopped directly beside her and extended the silver tray. Jessica did not even glance at my face. She reached out blindly with a perfectly manicured hand, wrapping her fingers around a crystal flute of champagne. She turned back to the broker and smiled a bright, empty smile. She told him that losing Harrison was a terrible shock, but that the family was finding a way to stay incredibly strong. She said that Preston was stepping up to manage the massive estate, and that they were excited to expand their corporate ventures using the capital I had left behind. She spoke about my death as if it were nothing more than a highly lucrative business acquisition. I stood there inches away from the woman who had urged my son to let me bleed to death, and I did not say a word. I let the digital microphone record every single syllable of her treacherous greed. A moment later, a sharp, clear chime rang out across the ballroom. Preston was standing at the front of the room on a small, elevated stage. He was tapping a silver spoon against a microphone. The low hum of conversation faded away, and the wealthy guests turned their attention toward him. I retreated to the shadowy perimeter of the room, leaning heavily against a marble pillar to take the weight off my agonizing surgical wounds. I watched my son look out over the crowd. He adjusted the lapels of his immaculate navy blue suit. He lowered his head perfectly, taking a slow, shaky breath that was meant to convey deep, unbearable sorrow. It was a flawless, sickening theatrical performance. Preston began to speak. His voice was soft, carrying a manufactured tremble that echoed through the massive speakers. He thanked everyone for coming to honor the legacy of a truly great man. He talked about how I had come from nothing, how I had built my life with my own two bare hands, and how I had taught him the absolute value of integrity and hard work. Hearing the word integrity come out of his mouth almost made me collapse. It took every ounce of physical restraint I possessed not to march onto that stage and drag him to the floor. Preston looked up at the ceiling, wiping a completely fake tear from the corner of his eye. He told the crowd that the accident at the construction site had been sudden and catastrophic. He paused, letting the heavy silence fill the room. Then he delivered the lie that chilled me down to the absolute marrow of my bones. He said that he had rushed to the hospital the exact moment he got the call. He told the crowd that he had sat by my bedside in my final hours. He claimed he held my hand as the machines faded and that my passing had been entirely peaceful. He said that my last words to him were a request to take my assets and build an empire. It was a monstrous, breathtaking fabrication. While I was suffocating on my own blood, begging him for help over a cell phone speaker, he had been drinking my scotch and complaining about being interrupted at a party. While I was coding on an operating table, he was faxing a legal document demanding the doctors let me die. I touched my chest, feeling the hard plastic outline of the audio recorder beneath my shirt. I was capturing the entire speech. Every single lie was being permanently documented. I was securing the absolute proof of his character, preparing to hand it over to a federal judge who would strip away every last shred of his arrogant pride. As Preston finished his speech to a round of warm, sympathetic applause, I felt my physical strength beginning to fail. The adrenaline that had carried me through the evening was wearing off, leaving behind a cold, sweeping exhaustion. The pain in my abdomen was becoming sharp and blinding. I needed to sit down before my legs gave out completely. I picked up my empty silver tray and slipped quietly through the heavy, swinging doors that led into the massive catering kitchen. The kitchen was empty, the staff having cleared out to prepare the dessert carts in the adjacent hallway. The room smelled of roasted meats and heavy cleaning chemicals. I leaned against cold stainless steel prep counter, gripping the metal edge tightly, trying to steady my ragged breathing. I closed my eyes and willed the agonizing pain to subside. Suddenly, the heavy swinging doors pushed open again. I quickly turned my back, grabbing a white cloth towel and pretending to polish the silver tray, making myself look busy and invisible. I kept my head down, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed across the tiled kitchen floor. I heard the sharp rustle of expensive suit fabric. 2 men had entered the room, seeking privacy away from the crowded ballroom. It was Preston and Uncle Frank. They stopped near the massive industrial refrigerators, entirely unaware that the catering worker polishing trays in the corner was the very ghost they were celebrating. I held my breath, keeping my back turned, tilting my body slightly to ensure the hidden microphone on my chest was pointed directly toward them. Frank spoke first. His voice was a harsh, urgent whisper, laced with nervous, crackling energy. He told Preston that the memorial was a massive success, that the sympathetic developers in the room were completely buying the act. But Frank was anxious. He said they needed to move incredibly fast, that holding on to the stolen real estate loans was getting incredibly risky without the final death certificate officially on file. I heard Preston let out a low, arrogant laugh. He sounded entirely unbothered, drunk on his own perceived brilliance. Preston told Frank to calm down. He said they had absolutely nothing to worry about. He boasted that the hospital administration was completely cowed by his threats of a malpractice lawsuit, and that the coroner was processing the forged paperwork exactly as they had paid him to do. Then Frank leaned in closer. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial, deadly serious hiss that echoed clearly off the stainless steel walls of the quiet kitchen. Frank said, "Listen to me, kid. Elias Montgomery is bringing the final federal affidavit to my dealership tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. Do you understand what this means? This is the absolute final hurdle. You sign that document, the $5 million holding trust clears the banking sweep, and the money drops directly into the offshore shell accounts by noon. We liquidate the local funds, pack the bags, and we vanish to the Caymans before the state probate courts even wake up. Preston did not hesitate. His voice was filled with sheer, unadulterated greed. He told Frank that his pen was already loaded. He promised that tomorrow morning they would sign the papers claim the phantom fortune and leave my entire legacy in the dust. They turned around and pushed back through the swinging doors, rejoining the lavish party waiting for them in the ballroom. I stood completely alone in the silent, empty kitchen. My grip on the silver tray was so tight my knuckles had turned pure white. I reached under my vest and pressed the stop button on the digital recorder. The trap was set. The bait had been taken entirely. They were walking straight into a federal snare of their own making, and tomorrow morning I was going to be the one to pull the trigger. The sun came up cold and hard over the city skyline. I was sitting in the back of an unmarked black surveillance van parked directly across the street from Frank's flagship auto dealership. The heavy metal doors of the van were shut tight against the freezing morning air. Inside the confined space smelled of stale coffee, electronic ozone, and pure heavy anticipation. My side still burned with a deep grinding agony from the emergency surgical stitches, but I did not care. Today was the day the circuit finally closed. Sullivan sat to my left, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes locked on the glowing digital monitors bolted to the wall of the van. Sitting to my right were Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Davis. These were not local beat cops who could be swayed by Preston's slick corporate suits or Frank's local business connections. They were seasoned federal investigators. When Sullivan and I had presented them with our mountain of evidence late last night, they did not waste a single second. We showed them the forged "Do Not Resuscitate" order, the offshore bank routing numbers, the audio recording from the false memorial, and the forged death certificate. The agents immediately secured federal warrants. They knew they were looking at a massive multi-million-dollar conspiracy crossing state lines. On the primary monitor, the live video feed flickered to life. Elias Montgomery had just stepped out of his luxury sedan. He was wearing a hidden high-definition camera perfectly concealed in the lapel of his charcoal suit. The audio feed piped through the speakers in our van crisp and entirely clear. We watched through Montgomery's chest as he walked through the sliding glass doors of the dealership. He strode confidently past the shiny, overpriced luxury cars and made his way straight toward the back executive wing. Frank's boardroom was unnecessarily lavish, featuring a massive frosted glass table and overpriced leather chairs bought entirely with funds laundered from my hard-earned pension. Through the camera feed, I saw them waiting. Preston was leaning back in a chair, bouncing his knee with an anxious, greedy energy. He was wearing another expensive custom suit, likely paid for with the money he stole from my commercial properties. Uncle Frank stood near the large window, looking out over his car lot, trying to appear calm, but I could see the nervous sweat glistening on his forehead. They thought they were minutes away from a massive payout. They thought they had successfully buried a 68-year-old master electrician without leaving a single trace. Montgomery entered the room, his demeanor completely flawless. He played the part of a busy, oblivious corporate fiduciary attorney to absolute perfection. Frank stepped forward immediately, offering a firm handshake and trying to force a charming, welcoming smile. Preston stood up quickly, adjusting his tie, practically salivating at the heavy leather briefcase Montgomery placed on the glass table. "Gentlemen," Montgomery said, his voice smooth and deeply professional, "I appreciate you accommodating my tight schedule. As you know, the Caldwell Holding Trust is subject to highly strict federal banking regulations. The sudden passing of Harrison Caldwell has triggered the immediate release clause for the $5 million asset, but we must adhere to the exact letter of the law before a single cent is moved." Preston nodded eagerly, pulling his chair closer to the table. Absolutely, Mr. Montgomery. My son lied with a perfectly straight face. My father was a very meticulous man. He always wanted things done by the book. It has been a profoundly tragic week for our family, but we are ready to finalize his affairs exactly as he intended. I sat in the dark van, my calloused hands balled into tight fists. Hearing him use my name, hearing him fake a tone of profound grief while actively trying to steal my life's work made the blood roar in my ears. For 40 years, I pulled heavy copper wire through commercial skyscrapers. I worked until my hands bled so that boy would never know the sting of poverty. Now he was using the manners I taught him to facilitate his own father's robbery. Agent Miller placed a calm, steady hand on my shoulder, giving me a silent nod of solidarity. We just needed to wait for the final strike. Montgomery snapped the brass locks on his briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of pristine, heavily stamped legal documents. He laid them out meticulously across the glass table. He placed a heavy silver pen directly next to the signature line. The process is straightforward, but it is legally absolute, Montgomery explained, looking directly into Preston's eyes. This is a sworn federal affidavit of survivorship and executor claim. By signing this document, you are formally attaching the certificate of death. You are legally binding yourself to the claim that Harrison Caldwell is deceased and that you are the sole rightful legal heir to this $5 million trust. Montgomery paused. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, letting the heavy weight of the moment hang in the air. He was giving them enough rope to hang themselves twice over. I must warn you, Mr. Caldwell, Montgomery said, his tone dropping into a grave, serious warning. Because this trust is federally protected, this document is filed directly with the United States Treasury. By signing this, you swear under penalty of federal perjury that every single statement is true. If there is any fraud, any misrepresentation of your father's status, or any deception regarding your role as executor, it crosses immediately into federal wire fraud and grand larceny. The penalties are severe and mandatory. Are you absolutely certain you are prepared to sign this today under those exact legal terms? I held my breath in the surveillance van. A normal man would have hesitated. A man with even a microscopic shred of a conscience would have looked at that paper, thought about the father who had loved him, and put the silver pen down. Preston did not even blink. He actually let out a short, arrogant laugh. Mr. Montgomery, my father is dead and buried, Preston said with chilling ease. I am his only son. There is no fraud here. Give me the pen. Through the clear video feed, I watched my own flesh and blood pick up the silver pen. He leaned over the glass table. The camera captured the exact moment the dark ink met the crisp white paper. Preston signed his full legal name with a rapid, practiced flourish. He signed away his freedom, his future, and any remaining bond he had to me. He slid the document across the table to Frank. Frank grabbed the pen with eager, sweaty fingers. "And I am signing as the primary witness," Frank said, his voice thick with unadulterated greed. He scribbled his name right below Preston's signature. He pulled a heavy metal stamper from his pocket and pressed his own official notary seal on the bottom of the page, completely validating the fraudulent document. In the surveillance van, Special Agent Davis tapped his keyboard rapidly, verifying the audio and video synchronization. "We have it," Davis whispered, his voice tight with professional satisfaction. "That is active federal perjury conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, all committed clearly on a live recording. The crime is absolute." Back in the boardroom, the tension vanished entirely from Preston's shoulders. He leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his hands together, like a man who had just won the ultimate lottery. The fake, tragic grief was completely gone from his face. "So, Mr. Montgomery," Preston asked, a smug, victorious grin spreading from ear to ear. "The paperwork is signed and sealed. When exactly does the wire transfer clear my accounts?" Montgomery did not smile. He methodically gathered the signed, heavily forged documents and slid them safely into his briefcase. He snapped the metal locks shut with a loud final click that echoed sharply through the quiet room. Montgomery stood up slowly, adjusting his tailored suit jacket. He looked straight into his own lapel camera, knowing I was watching closely from the dark van across the street. His voice was completely calm, smooth, and utterly lethal. "I believe the primary account holder needs to authorize it in person." I stood in the narrow, dimly lit hallway just outside Frank's executive boardroom, my back pressed flat against the cool plaster wall. Through the heavy oak double doors, I could hear the faint, muffled murmur of their voices. Preston was probably grinning from ear to ear, imagining the millions of dollars flooding into his offshore accounts at this very second. I took a slow, deep breath, holding the air in my lungs for a long moment. The surgical wire holding my ribs together pulled sharply, a burning, agonizing reminder of the cold operating table where they had eagerly tried to end my life. But today I did not look like a frail old man bleeding out in a hospital trauma ward. I did not look like the dusty, calloused master electrician they thought they could so easily discard and bury. Sullivan had brought me a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. I wore a crisp, heavily starched white shirt and a dark silk tie. My leather boots were polished to a mirror shine. I stood incredibly tall, forcing my spine completely straight, actively ignoring the blinding pain radiating through my abdomen. I felt like the absolute master of the domain I had built from absolutely nothing. I was the architect of their destruction, and it was time to tear down the building. Elias Montgomery's voice filtered through the heavy wooden doors, perfectly clear and remarkably calm. He had just delivered his final, lethal line. I heard him tell Preston that the primary account holder needed to authorize the wire transfer in person. That was my exact cue. I stepped forward and placed my hands flat against the heavy double doors of the boardroom. I pushed them open with a smooth, powerful thrust. The heavy wood swung inward, the brass hinges gliding silently. I stepped over the threshold and into the bright morning light flooding the executive room. Montgomery took a single calculated step backward, yielding the floor entirely to me. The scene inside the room froze as if time itself had instantly stopped. Jessica had apparently joined them this morning to celebrate their massive, fraudulent payday. She was standing near a small silver coffee cart in the corner of the room, holding a steaming ceramic mug in both hands. When her eyes locked onto my face, every single drop of blood drained instantly from her cheeks. Her perfect, confident posture completely collapsed. Her manicured fingers went slack, losing all their strength. The heavy ceramic mug slipped from her grasp and hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. The dark, steaming coffee splashed violently across her expensive designer shoes, but she did not even flinch. She just stared at me, her mouth hanging open in a silent, suffocating, breathless scream. Uncle Frank was standing near the large floor-to-ceiling window overlooking his car lot. The moment he saw me walk through those doors, the air seemed to physically leave his lungs. He stumbled backward, his heavy leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished floorboard. His wide shoulders hit the thick glass pane with a dull, heavy thud. He brought a trembling, sweaty hand up to his chest, clutching the expensive fabric of his dress shirt right over his heart. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost crawl directly out of a fresh grave. His face turned a sickly pale shade of ash. He tried to speak. He tried to form a single coherent word, but only a pathetic raspy wheeze escaped his tightening throat. But it was Preston who gave me the greatest, most profound sense of absolute vindication. My only son was sitting in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. Just seconds ago, he had been wearing a smug, arrogant, victorious smirk, fully believing he had successfully outsmarted the entire world. I watched that exact smirk die a sudden, agonizing death. I watched the profound, primal terror wash completely over his features. His eyes widened to an impossible, unnatural size. His jaw trembled violently, his lips parting in mute horror. The realization that I was not dead, that I was standing right in front of him in a custom suit, and that he had just signed a fraudulent federal affidavit under oath, crashed down on his mind like a falling concrete pillar. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or scream or curse at them. 40 years of handling high-voltage commercial electricity teaches you a very fundamental truth. The quiet, steady hum of a live wire is infinitely more dangerous than a loud, flashy spark. I walked slowly toward the massive mahogany table. The room was so incredibly quiet that you could hear the fabric of my tailored suit moving with every single step. I stopped directly across from Preston. I looked deep into his terrified, trembling, cowardly eyes. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment before I finally spoke. My voice was icy, perfectly calm, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth or affection. I looked down at the boy I had raised and recited the exact words he had spoken to me on the phone while I was bleeding to death in the trauma ward. Dad, I am incredibly busy at a party right now. Just tell the doctors to use the generic stuff. I cannot deal with this tonight. The words hung in this cold air of the boardroom, heavy and absolute. Preston visibly flinched, shrinking back deep into his leather chair, as if I had physically struck him across the face with a steel wrench. A miserable, pathetic, high-pitched whimper escaped his lips. He realized in that exact, devastating second that I knew absolutely everything. I had heard every single word. I knew exactly the kind of monster he truly was. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I did not rush my movements. I opened the flap with deliberate, methodical precision. I pulled out the forged "Do Not Resuscitate" order that he had faxed to the hospital. I tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. The paper slid smoothly across the glass surface and stopped right in front of his folded, shaking hands. Next, I pulled out the banking ledgers we had liberated from Frank's floor safe. The offshore routing numbers, the fake commercial property equity loans, the massive transfers he had funneled into Uncle Frank's dummy shell companies. I tossed those heavy packets down too. They landed with a thick, satisfying smack that made Frank jump against the window. Finally, I pulled out the thick stack of printed audio transcripts from the false memorial service at the country club. I had highlighted every single greedy, treacherous word he and Jessica had spoken while drinking expensive champagne and celebrating my brutal death. I threw the transcripts down on top of the pile. I looked at Preston and told him that he thought I was just an uneducated, outdated dinosaur. I told him he assumed that because I wore a hard hat and carried a metal lunchbox my entire life, I would not understand digital banking, offshore trusts, or secure corporate networks. I told him he had profoundly, fatally underestimated the man who built the very infrastructure his comfortable world relied on. I explained, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls, that every single document currently sitting on that mahogany table, combined with the federal affidavit he had just signed with Elias Montgomery, constituted a massive, undeniable mountain of federal felonies. I told him that his entire life, his polished corporate career, his elite country club memberships, and his luxury cars were completely, permanently gone. The massive financial empire he thought he was stealing was turning to toxic dust right inside his sweaty hands. The facade of the polished, untouchable corporate auditor completely shattered into a million pieces. Preston collapsed entirely. His body seemed to lose all structural integrity. He slid off the expensive leather chair and fell hard onto his knees on the wooden floor. He started sobbing. Loud, ugly, desperate tears streamed rapidly down his pale face. He reached out with trembling, desperate hands trying to grab the hem of my suit pants. He begged me. He cried out in a wet, choking voice that he was so incredibly sorry, that he had made a terrible, foolish mistake, that he had gotten entirely too deep into debt, and simply did not know how to stop the momentum. He pleaded for his life, begging his father for a mercy he had absolutely refused to show me when I was dying on an operating table. And then, exactly as I expected, the ultimate sickening cowardice revealed itself. Preston pulled his hands back from my suit and pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Uncle Frank. He screamed through his tears that it was all Frank's idea. He sobbed uncontrollably, telling the room that Frank had forced him into signing the real estate loans, that Frank had aggressively set up the offshore accounts to save his failing dealerships, that Frank was the one who had tracked down and bribed the corrupt county coroner for the forged death certificate. He threw his own uncle under the bus without a single solitary second of hesitation, absolutely desperate to save his own pathetic skin. Frank watched the absolute catastrophic collapse of their criminal enterprise. He heard Preston viciously betraying him, screaming accusations that would secure him decades in federal prison. Frank realized instantly that the walls were rapidly closing in, and that there was no smooth talking his way out of a live recording of federal perjury. The sweat was pouring down his red, panicked face in thick, heavy rivers. Frank did not try to beg. He did not try to plead for forgiveness or explain his treacherous actions. The sheer panic overrode his rational thought. He turned sharply away from the large glass window and made a desperate, wild dash for the side exit door of the boardroom. He moved with a frantic, clumsy, terrified speed, his heavy shoes pounding violently against the polished floorboards. He was panting heavily, his eyes locked on the brass handle that led out to the service bay and the open alleyway beyond. He reached out with both hands, grabbing the handle and violently yanking the heavy wooden door open to make his cowardly escape. But Frank did not find an empty, quiet hallway waiting for him. He pulled the door wide open, only to find 3 heavily armed federal agents standing shoulder to shoulder on the other side, completely blocking his path. Special Agent Miller stepped forward, his federal badge clearly visible on his belt, his expression completely devoid of any human sympathy. He looked at Frank's terrified, sweating face, and then he looked past him at Preston, who was still sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. The trap had closed perfectly. The escape routes were permanently sealed. The master electrician had completely isolated the corrupt circuit. The power had been cut, and there was nowhere left for them to run. Special Agent Miller stepped firmly into the boardroom with his hand resting heavily on his utility belt. The heavy silence of the executive office was abruptly shattered by the sharp metallic clanking of steel handcuffs being unlatched. Preston was still on his knees on the polished mahogany floor. He was weeping like a terrified, lost child. All of his expensive corporate polish had completely melted away in an instant. He looked up at the federal agents with wide, bloodshot eyes, begging them to understand that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the agents did not care about his desperate tears or his expensive custom suit. They grabbed him firmly by the shoulders and hauled him roughly to his feet. They twisted his arms behind his back without any gentleness. The cold steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a heavy, absolute finality. Uncle Frank stood frozen near the large glass window. He did not try to fight. He did not even try to argue. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the federal authorities drained every single ounce of fight right out of his heavy body. Special Agent Davis spun him around and pushed him hard against the frosted glass wall. The impact rattled the expensive glass panes. Frank gasped for breath as his own hands were bound tightly behind him. The man who had smiled warmly at my wife's funeral and promised to protect our family was now trembling and pale, facing the absolute destruction of his fraudulent life. Jessica was standing in the puddle of spilled coffee near the silver catering cart. When an agent approached her with a third pair of handcuffs, she started screaming wildly. She screamed that she had absolutely nothing to do with this operation. She pointed her shaking, manicured fingers at Preston and Frank, yelling loudly that they had manipulated her into participating. But the agent calmly informed her that she was being charged with federal conspiracy to commit wire fraud and accessory to attempted medical manslaughter. She tried to pull away from him. She cried out that the metal cuffs were ruining her expensive silk dress and bruising her wrists. The absolute vanity of her complaints in the face of decades in a federal prison was completely pathetic to witness. The agents marched them out of the boardroom in a single-file line. I followed closely behind, walking shoulder to shoulder with Elias Montgomery. The physical pain in my stitched abdomen was completely numb now, replaced entirely by the pure, roaring adrenaline of absolute justice. We walked them down the long executive hallway and out onto the main floor of the flagship dealership. It was mid-morning, and the vast vehicle showroom was packed with people. Dozens of sales employees were standing by the shiny luxury cars holding their clipboards. Wealthy customers holding glossy brochures turned around to stare. The entire building went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop on the polished white tiles. Preston tried to bow his head to hide his face from the staring crowd. He was the golden boy of the local corporate world, and now he was being publicly paraded like a common street criminal. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkled, and his face was slick with sweat and tears. Uncle Frank kept his eyes glued to the floor, refusing to look at the people who had worked for him for years. The mechanics from the service bay stepped out from the garage in their greasy overalls, wiping their hands on shop towels. They stood in silent judgment, watching the wealthy dealership owner being hauled away in total disgrace. I stood near the main receptionist desk and watched them take the long, agonizing walk out the main glass doors. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 federal cruisers painted the morning street in vibrant warning colors. The entire neighborhood had stopped to watch the spectacular downfall. They shoved Preston and Jessica into the back of the exact same police cruiser. Even through the heavy reinforced glass windows of the squad car, I could see the absolute chaos erupting between them. Jessica was screaming at the top of her lungs. Her face was twisted in pure venomous rage. She finally realized that her lavish life of country club dinners and luxury tropical vacations was permanently over. She was going to a federal penitentiary, and she blamed Preston entirely for failing to secure the phantom $5 million fortune. The supposed loyalty between thieves evaporates the exact second the consequences arrive at the front door. Preston just sat there in the back seat with his head resting between his knees, looking completely shattered and defeated. While the police cruisers drove away, Elias Montgomery did not waste a single second of our advantage. He pulled out his phone and made a series of rapid, precise calls to his high-powered legal team. Within minutes, the court orders we had prepared in advance were officially filed with the federal judges. Montgomery executed an aggressive total freeze on every single one of their financial assets. The federal government seized the offshore holding accounts and the dummy shell corporations before Preston even reached the holding cell at the downtown precinct. The millions of dollars they had stolen from my commercial equity loans were immediately locked down, sealed tight, and slated for full restitution to my trust. Over the next 24 hours, the devastation of their lavish lifestyle was absolute and breathtaking to behold. Federal marshals arrived at Preston and Jessica's massive suburban estate with legal warrants in hand. They brought heavy tow trucks and hauled away the sleek silver luxury sedan and the expensive imported sports car parked in the wide circular driveway. The banks froze all their credit cards, leaving them completely destitute and unable to post bail. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked immediately with a public notice issued directly to the board of directors citing federal fraud charges. Frank's multiple auto dealerships were shut down by the state and cordoned off with yellow federal warning tape. The massive empire of lies they had built using my stolen pension funds and forged signatures was completely pulverized in a single afternoon. They were left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the cold, concrete walls of their holding cells. The legal proceedings that followed over the next few brutal months were incredibly swift and entirely merciless. There were no quiet, closed-door settlements. There were no sympathetic plea deals offered by the prosecution. Elias Montgomery made absolutely sure that the full crushing weight of the federal justice system came down upon them. When the trial finally began, I sat in the front row of the federal courtroom every single day. I wore a simple, clean suit, and my quiet dignity like a shield of armor. The federal prosecutor laid out the mountain of evidence with surgical precision. They played the digital audio recordings I had captured using the hidden microphone at the false memorial service. The entire packed courtroom listened in stunned, absolute silence as Preston and Jessica laughed about my death and bragged loudly about spending my retirement money. The jury heard Frank whispering clearly about fleeing to the Caymans with the $5 million wire transfer. The prosecutors presented the forged commercial property deeds, the fake offshore consulting invoices, and the heavy physical ledgers we had pulled directly from the floor safe during the night raid. But the most devastating piece of evidence of the entire trial was the forged death certificate and the fraudulent "do not resuscitate" order. The prosecutor projected the forged medical documents onto a massive digital screen in the center of the courtroom. He explained to the jury in a cold, steady voice that my son had actively engaged in a premeditated plot to let me bleed to death on an operating table simply to expedite his unearned inheritance. It was not just a case of simple financial fraud or corporate embezzlement. It was a cold, calculated attempt at medical manslaughter driven by absolute, unadulterated greed. The judge looked down from the high wooden bench with a mixture of profound disgust and deep sorrow. When the day of sentencing finally arrived, the courtroom was completely packed with local reporters, former business associates, and curious onlookers. Preston stood before the judge wearing an oversized orange jail jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was messy and unwashed. His face was pale, sunken, and aged by a decade of stress. He looked incredibly small and weak. He tried to read a prepared written statement of apology to the court, but his voice cracked and failed him completely. The judge cut him off sharply. The judge stated loudly that in all his long years serving on the federal bench, he had rarely seen a familial betrayal so intimate and so deeply wicked. The judge struck his wooden gavel and sentenced Preston to a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The charges included attempted medical manslaughter, massive wire fraud, and grand larceny. There would be absolutely no possibility of early parole. Preston collapsed heavily into his wooden chair, weeping openly into his hands, as the federal bailiffs prepared to take him away in chains. Uncle Frank was ordered to stand next. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for his primary role as the financial architect of the embezzlement and money laundering scheme. His remaining auto dealerships and commercial properties were fully liquidated by the state government to pay back the stolen funds and the massive federal fines. Frank looked over his shoulder at me one last time, but I offered him absolutely no reaction. He had made his bed of lies, and now he was going to sleep in it for over a decade. Jessica received a harsh sentence of 7 years for federal conspiracy and acting as an accessory to massive corporate fraud. As she was sentenced, she looked back at me from across the crowded courtroom, her eyes filled with bitter, desperate regret. But I felt absolutely no pity for any of them. They had willingly chosen their dark path. They had chosen greed over loyalty. They had chosen a phantom offshore fortune over the life of a hard-working father who had gladly given them everything he had. I walked slowly out of the federal courthouse that afternoon and stepped into the warm, bright city sunlight. The heavy, suffocating burden I had been carrying since the very moment I woke up in that hospital trauma ward was finally lifted completely from my tired shoulders. The broken circuit was clear. The toxic rot had been completely excised from my life forever. I had lost a son to the poison of greed, but I had regained my absolute freedom, my stolen legacy, and my quiet honor. I took a deep, clean breath of the fresh air and walked steadily toward the future, leaving their pulverized reputations and their completely shattered lives entirely behind me in the dust. I drove my old truck back to the neighborhood as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line. The sky was painted in deep, rich shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the familiar streets. Everything outside looked exactly the same as it had for the past 30 years. The large oak trees I had planted with my own 2 hands still stood tall and unyielding. The brick retaining walls I had laid piece by piece still held the earth firmly in place. But everything inside of me had profoundly changed. I pulled into my wide driveway and shifted the truck into park. I turned off the engine and just sat there in the quiet cab for a long time, staring at the house. I had built this place to be a safe fortress for my family. I had wired every single room, measuring the circuits, calculating the loads, and making sure it would stand the test of time. For a brief, terrifying moment, my own flesh and blood had managed to lock me out of my own life. They had tried to take this fortress and sell it to the highest bidder to fund a life of empty luxury. But the fortress was finally mine again. The legal devastation had swept them away, and I was the only one left standing. I stepped out of the truck and felt the cool evening breeze on my face. The pain in my surgically repaired abdomen was still there, a dull ache reminding me of the mortality they had tried to exploit, but it no longer held any power over me. I walked up the front stone steps and reached into my pocket for my heavy brass key. I slid it into the deadbolt and turned it. The heavy lock clicked with a loud, satisfying sound. I pushed the solid wooden door open and stepped across the threshold. The house was completely silent. But this time, it was not the suffocating, hostile silence of an invaded home. It was the peaceful, deep silence of a blank canvas, waiting patiently to be restored. I walked straight into the main living room and stood in the center of the hardwood floor. I looked around at the cold, soulless modern furniture Jessica had brought in to replace our warm history. I stared at the massive, pretentious, abstract painting hanging over my beautiful stone fireplace. A fresh surge of energy rushed through my veins. I did not wait another second. I went straight out to the garage and grabbed a stack of heavy-duty black garbage bags. I marched back inside and began the physical work of cleansing my home. I stripped away every single trace of their arrogant greed. I pulled the abstract art off the wall and carried it directly out to the curb. I gathered up all the sterile gray throw pillows, the ridiculous expensive modern sculptures, and the meaningless decorative pieces they had scattered around to erase my existence. I threw them all into the trash bags without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. When the superficial trash was gone, I walked into the formal dining room. I approached the dark corner where they had carelessly shoved the 3 heavy cardboard moving boxes. Inside those boxes was my entire life with Barbara. I knelt down carefully, ignoring the stiff protest of my ribs, and pulled the cardboard flaps open. I reached inside and gently lifted the framed photographs out one by one. I wiped the dust from the glass with the sleeve of my shirt. There was our wedding picture taken outside the small church downtown. There was the photograph of Barbara laughing at the Grand Canyon, her hair blowing wildly in the wind. There was the picture of us standing proudly in front of this very house the day the final bricks were laid. I carried the photographs back into the living room. I placed them meticulously back onto the stone fireplace mantel, exactly where they belonged. I retrieved the beautiful engraved silver clock I had bought for our 25th wedding anniversary and set it right in the center. I wound the key in the back, and the soft, steady ticking sound instantly filled the quiet room. It sounded like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been dead. I went to the kitchen and found the cinnamon candles Barbara always loved to burn. I struck a match and lit the wick. Then I went to my study and brought out my old pipe tobacco. Within minutes, the sharp, sterile chemical scent of Jessica's expensive air fresheners was completely overwhelmed and eradicated. The house smelled like sweet cinnamon-rich, earthy tobacco and old polished wood. The house felt like a home again. It finally smelled like absolute peace. I sank down into my favorite comfortable armchair and let out a long, slow breath. The physical exertion had tired me, but my soul felt lighter than it had in months. As I sat there watching the warm orange glow of the sunset fade into the evening shadows, my mind drifted to the prison cells where Preston and Uncle Frank were currently sitting. I thought about the nature of family and the tragic lessons I had been forced to learn. For my entire life, I had believed that blood was the ultimate bond. I believed that because Preston was my son, he would naturally carry my values, my work ethic, and my sense of honor. I believed that because Frank was my late wife's brother, he deserved endless second chances. I had poured my money, my time, and my unconditional love into a bottomless pit of entitlement. I realized sitting in that quiet, peaceful room that greed is a slow, silent poison. It sneaks into the foundation of a person and rots the structural beams until there is nothing left but an empty, hungry void. Preston had grown up in a beautiful home with a father who provided everything, but he had completely failed to understand the value of the sweat it took to build it. He looked at my calloused hands and saw weakness. He looked at my hard work and saw a shortcut to unearned wealth. Frank had fed that poison whispering toxic promises of easy money and offshore accounts. They had bonded over their shared laziness and their mutual lack of morality. They thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they could simply outmaneuver an old electrician because I did not wear a corporate suit. But they forgot that men who build things with their hands know exactly how to deconstruct them. I knew I could not let the millions of dollars I had recovered simply sit in a bank account gathering interest. That money represented 40 years of brutal, honest labor, pulling high-voltage wire through commercial skyscrapers in the freezing cold and the blistering heat. It needed to be used for something that actually mattered. It needed to create a real, lasting legacy that Preston had so desperately tried to destroy. The following week, I called Elias Montgomery and Sullivan to my home. We sat around the dining room table drinking hot coffee and eating fresh pastries from the local bakery. I told them my plan, and they immediately set to work drafting the legal framework. We established a massive vocational scholarship fund. I named it the Harrison and Barbara Caldwell Trade Foundation. I did not want the money going to pretentious corporate universities or elite business schools that churned out arrogant kids in expensive suits. I wanted the money to go to the young men and women who understood the value of a hard day's work. I wanted to help the kids with dirt under their fingernails and calluses on their hands. Within a few months, the foundation was fully operational. We partnered with the local electrical union and the regional trade schools. We offered full-ride scholarships to young apprentices who wanted to learn the electrical trade, plumbing, carpentry, and heavy machinery operation. We bought them their first sets of professional-grade tools. We paid for their certification exams and their safety gear. We gave them the solid financial grounding they needed to build their own lives from scratch without taking on crippling debt. I started personally interviewing the candidates. I met young men who reminded me so much of myself at their age, eager, hungry, and willing to work until their muscles ached just to provide for their families. I met young women who were breaking into the trades with fierce determination and brilliant minds. When I shook their hands, I felt the rough texture of honest labor. I saw the bright, genuine gratitude in their eyes when we handed them their acceptance letters. They did not look at me like an ATM. They looked at me like a mentor, a guide, and a true friend. I realized then that my family had not been destroyed by Preston and Frank. My family had just expanded. These young, hard-working kids who valued integrity and loyalty over fast cash were my true legacy. They were the ones who would carry my name forward with honor. The pain of losing my biological son to a federal penitentiary will never completely vanish. There will always be a small scar on my heart where his betrayal struck me. But I no longer carry the crushing weight of guilt or confusion. I did everything I could for him. I loved him unconditionally, but I could not save him from his own corrupt nature. The universe has a profound, undeniable way of balancing the scales of justice. You cannot build a life on a foundation of lies and expect it to stand firm when the storm arrives. You see, a man can build the strongest electrical grid in the world, but if the grounding wire is corrupt, the whole system will eventually catch fire. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. They tried to bury me to steal my legacy, not realizing I was the one who owned the shovels. I dug myself out of the grave they prepared for me, and I buried their entire fraudulent empire instead. I took the power back, and I used it to illuminate the path for people who actually deserve to walk it. I am 68 years old. My chest is held together with surgical wire, and my hands are permanently scarred from decades of pulling copper. But as I sit here on my front porch watching the neighborhood wake up to a brand new day, I know with absolute certainty that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I am at peace. The circuit is clear. The power is flowing right. And the future is brighter than it has ever been. If my story brought you a sense of justice today, please hit the like button to support this old electrician and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our upcoming life stories. I want to know who is keeping me company today. Please drop your current city and the exact time you are watching this video in the comments below. I read every single one. See you in the next story with love and respect.